Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Napoleon, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Vanessa Kirby, directed by Ridley Scott. Now, before I get into this, I have seen this movie before, once in theaters, once when I showed it to my mother, and twice for this review. So it's a total of 4 times. I first watched the theatrical cut, the one that I saw back in theaters, and then when I took notes, I did it on the director's cut. Big mistake there. And you're about to find out why. But let's get into the movie and see if it's any good. As I remember, I don't know, something. In 1789, at the Revolution of France, we get a decapitation of Marie Antoinette as a young Napoleon Bonaparte, played by Joaquin Phoenix, watching. And one problem of, first of all, is beginning with the casting of choice of Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon, as the real guy is like 5 foot, what, 2 or 7 inches tall, whereas Joaquin Phoenix is like 5'8", as that was bothering me from the get go. As he meets with Barbaras, as Napoleon wants to make a war happen, and we move on to 1790, and here's another problem with the movie, as it jumps all over the fucking place over the years of Napoleon's existence. And I really do like the cinematography, as that's director Ridley Scott's greatest strengths. But his weakness is telling a very good story. And what is the story of this movie other than jumping all over the years rather too quickly and learning about Napoleon as we read in the history books? As I don't know, as you can read about this guy in history books or on the internet, you don't have to watch this movie in its theatrical or director's cut version, as they're equally as boring, in my opinion. Although the battle sequences are great to watch, as we get one in the gate where Napoleon's men come in and take over the land, and that sequence is shot great. But when his horse is blown up, I was like, oh shit! They killed an animal, and they showed it 12 minutes into the movie. And I'm already against this movie at this point, because what the fuck is that all? Is it all about other than what the history books and the internet tells you? We move on to 1798, and I'm sorry, I'm getting really confused in the timeline system in this movie. In France, and this is a book where when they talk about when this movie takes place, for example, in a prison, where we meet Josephine, who will end up being Napoleon's wife and played by Vanessa Kirby, as this is one of her best performances in her career, as she steals the movie from the star of this movie, Joaquin Phoenix. And she goes with Teresa to live with her, and Josephine, no matter what I think of this movie, is hands down the best part of the movie, in my opinion. We get another decapitation scene in 1793, and these scenes are graphic for sure, while a woman who's a nun, gets decapitated herself. And what did she do, as this movie doesn't explain it? What she did to deserve the death, and the director's cut doesn't do anything to tell me either, which is a real shame. While we get in a courtroom, as the judge is guilty for what reason, I don't fully understand. Why as the dialogue in this movie makes no sense, and am I alone thinking I don't understand what the fuck is happening throughout the movie? While the judge shoots his face, and it will kill him. Well, it won't kill him, let me rephrase that, but it doesn't, and gets decapitated himself, and we get the Reign of Terror in 1794, and people were killed while Josephine gets back to the house she lived in and tries to find her daughter, Lucille, and find a woman and a couple of kids, as we move on to Napoleon at a celebration at an opera in 1794. And at the point, I'm just confused at where the fuck we're at in the story, because it's jumping to one place to another, as that was confusing enough as it is and annoying the shit out of me. Napoleon meets Josephine by staring at her, and do they have chemistry? She does, and he doesn't, as Vanessa Kirby pulls the Josephine off better than Joaquin Phoenix can pull off Napoleon. And in the theatrical cut, Napoleon was asked her name, whereas in the director's cut, Napoleon doesn't want to know her name, as Paul humps her ass. And Napoleon gets a young visitor, which happens to be Josephine's son, Eugene, I'm going to call him for the rest of the show, asking Napoleon to give his father's sword back, and he decides to return it at a later time by coming to the house and giving it to Eugene, while Josephine and Lucille witness Napoleon giving him back the sword, and have some lunch together, Napoleon and Josephine. And Napoleon falls in love with Josephine. And I'm just really bored at this point. And I'm taking notes on the director's cut, which is a 3.5 hour long movie. As Ridley Scott makes these director's cuts of his movies after Alien, after Blade Runner, after The Martian, and maybe Gladiator. I'll get there next time. Ridley, this is getting ridiculous. As far as director's cuts are concerned, I think you really need to knock it off with the director's cut bullshit, as it drags every single goddamn time. We move on to 1795, where the townspeople are enraged with Napoleon as a general, and he has no choice but to kill the people who stand against him. And afterhand gets drunk, and Napoleon and Josephine get married and sign their marriage certificate. As Napoleon walks into church and celebrates his marriage to Josephine and humps her ass so he can have a boy. And this goes on like repeatedly, and she starts making demands out of Napoleon as he has to leave, and she doesn't know if he'll return back home, and he says he'll always return home, and writes a note to Josephine as while writing in Egypt in 1798 or something. I don't know where the fuck this movie's going. As he steps into the feet of Alexander the Great and Caesar, and she's been hit on by another man, and some of this shit is bothering me. As Egypt looks great while Josephine is having an affair with her lover left to right, and I'm thinking she's a fucking hooker while married to Napoleon, as it makes no sense to me. Napoleon sees inside of a dead Egyptian as it's a mummy, and Napoleon is told Josephine has taken a lover, and that's why she doesn't write him back. And ladies, I'm no expert, but here's a tip. When you're married, if your husband goes to the war, you better not have an affair with another man behind his back, because that's how he finds out Josephine goes off to parties behind Napoleon's back. And he gets back home not very happy with Josephine, as she doesn't show up when he arrives home and chats with their maid. And this movie is very irritating, and it's very fucking boring. Napoleon throws all of Josephine's stuff out of the house, and he has a decision of what she is, as she's nothing without him, and he's the most important thing in the world, and he in her life, and makes her say that, and which was intimidating, as she challenges him by making him saying the words she did to him. And this is a toxic relationship that doesn't need to go on, but eventually they'll get divorced later in the movie. Napoleon asks, whose country are we in? As he answers, it's his country. He's accused for deserting his men in Egypt, while Napoleon makes people resign as their positions with the French government. And a lot of these scenes are making me snooze off. And why does this need a director's cut is beyond me. The resignation men try to fight Napoleon's men, and they're trying to kill Napoleon, and the guards charge at them. And Napoleon says to France, shall we vote? Which kind of amusing, but a dumb scene in my opinion, as this movie is very slowly paced. It goes absolutely nowhere while Napoleon and Josephine move into the house with the government, which is something like a White House of France. When some of the shots do look great, as I'll give the movie that, as there are times when we get the battle sequences, those scenes look magnificent, while Napoleon writes a note to the King of France, this scene he's laughing like the Joker, but wrong movie at the wrong time, I'll say, as the sequel comes out next year, which, spoiler alert for that film. Napoleon is at a party as he talks with someone. I can't tell who is who, nor do I know what they're saying, while Napoleon tells the King of France he'll make the people scared, while he points the map on the floor of his house. If we go to war in 1800, and he receives news about how he should become the King of France, and Napoleon humps Josephine's ass, second time, and this is I'll take that back. This is the third time we get something as explicit as that, and that bothered me. And we see a burning carriage, which is a great shot, as Napoleon is being asked to be overthrown by the Duke of Wellington, and the battle scenes were greatly shot, and so was the fire on the carriage. Napoleon crawls under the dining table while grabbing Josephine. We move on to her old lover and being at the ceremony, where Napoleon becomes the emperor, as he grabs the crown and says he found it one day as he crowns himself, and they walk out of Captain Charles meets with Napoleon, and he confesses to Captain Charles as well as he asks how did he create 3 boys, and he responds pleasuring her for 30 minutes despite he can't remember how he got 3 boys, which was an uncomfortable and explicit scene. Napoleon says if there's not a boy coming out of her privates, let's say, there will be a divorce, and have a brief food fight and the kiss while we move on to a battle sequence with Russia and Austria in 1805 as Napoleon's men get prepared for war as they're in the snow on the ice as they wait in the next morning. And no matter what I think of this movie, this is the best battle sequence we're going to get for the rest of the movie, as this was shot magnificently, as it was fucking intense. After the battle, Napoleon meets with an emperor about an error he has made as he chose not to take prisoner, and toasts of friendship. And he gets back to dance with Josephine and talks with his mother, who wants to give Napoleon a baby boy. He's about to make the woman pregnant. Hopefully it's a boy, while Josephine asks Napoleon for a divorce, and she knows he has a bastard child. And this goes back and forth from boring to great battle sequences to back to boring, as I'm bored now at this point. Napoleon signs the divorce papers as she's reluctant about it because they've been married for 15 years and they go their separate ways as she finds a place in France and Napoleon visits there, and he says he misses her and to take care of her health as it's important to him, which is true in life and didn't make much sense in this movie. Why are they still writing to each other? And we move on to the year 1807, where he chats with the King of Britain, who asks to call him brother, and Napoleon asks for his sister Anna, who is 15 years old. And at this point, the character is fucking disgusting, as she's like twice his age, as he disgusts me. Napoleon meets with Anna as well as his first son and his family is born. It makes Josephine meet the baby boy, while the King of Britain and ruler of Russia meet about Napoleon as we move on to 1812 as Napoleon is about to invade the Russians. And we get another battle sequence that was pretty well done, as some of the Napoleon soldiers are ambushed and killed by some Russians and Britain's men, while Napoleon writes to Josephine because he won the battle against the Russians and Britain's men. And I did like the battle sequences, as it was fantastic to watch. Napoleon finds a city where the villagers might have left a while back, as Napoleon asks where are they at, and he calls for them like they're cats, which was amusing, and they sleep there for a while, as Napoleon hears a noise of fire in the city as the Russians and Britain's men burn their own city instead of negotiating with him, and they continue to search for them as they keep camping out and eventually get to their hideout. And one of the soldiers burns his foot as a house burns down. And do we need the director's cut? Absolutely not, as it's very unnecessary. Napoleon's men freeze to death, and Napoleon comes back to France, and he resigns from being Emperor of France. And we move on to the year 1814, and Napoleon is living somewhere in the desert, and I wish it was Egypt, but it's not, as it's an island. And we move on to the King of France, visiting Josephine and talks and dances with her, while Napoleon is jealous and beats up on the newspapers. And he visits his mother while on the island and writes to Josephine about how he wants to take back what belongs to him, which happens to be her as well as France. And she writes to tell him to come quickly as Napoleon returns to France, and she sees a doctor as she has a cold. With the score was distracting me. And this was another movie where it was in that was in another movie in the Wolf of Wall Street, and that was the movie I was thinking of right now, and I'm just bored. The French government is warned about the return of Napoleon and armies trying to arrest him, but he wishes to speak to his men, and the soldiers aim at him, and Napoleon says he misses them and wants to come back home, and they want him to come back while the King of France can barely walk. And Napoleon goes to Josephine's house, and he learns she died from her sickness, and is very sad as she was the best thing about the movie, and she stole the show from Napoleon. So now, who's going to carry the rest of the movie? Because Joaquin Phoenix can't do it, as he plays a disgusting character who comes off very unlikable from the beginning of the movie. As we move on to 1815, in a meeting with the French government, and they prepared for war against Russia, Britain, and England. And I just want this movie to end, as I've got about 30 more minutes of movie left in this director's cut. Napoleon finished taking a dump, and I can't believe I'm saying that for a movie set in the 1800s at this point, but to be fair, this movie is garbage for sure. While they prepare for war, and Napoleon wants the rain to stop, and he can't help that, but eventually it does stop, and there's a rifle sniper aiming at Napoleon, and he has him on sight and wants to shoot Napoleon dead, but he's told to stand down as Napoleon brings out the cannons. And after the rain stops, Napoleon starts the war, and we begin another adequate battle sequence, as this may be the least impressive battle sequence in this movie, in my opinion. Napoleon ends up winning the battle, as it was meant to be a trap for Napoleon, and Napoleon celebrates by teaching kids about the geography and expects greatness while on a ship, and the shot in the ship was great to look at. While on the ship, Napoleon chats with the general of England, and they get him out on exile at an island, as an officer keeps an eye on Napoleon, and he accepts he gets to the island, and Josephine writes a note about how next time she'll be the emperor, and he'll take orders from her, while Lucille and another little girl of his family play swords with branches and learn some geography, as they learn the capital of France and Russia, and who burned them down, as he drinks some water and suddenly dies. And the movie ends there, as the climax was making me think, oh my god, this director's cut is finally over, as I was bored for half of it. But how bored was I? Can we get to the rating, please? I'll give this movie a 2.8 out of 10. There are things I complimented the movie on, and one is the cinematography looks great. One of them, the battle sequences, looks fantastic, is two. And third is Vanessa Kirby delivers one of her best performances in her career. But there's a shitload of problems with this movie. Starting with Joaquin Phoenix is 5 foot 8 inches tall, whereas the real Napoleon is 5 foot 2 or 7 inches tall. And they cast him to play the short man. And why didn't they CGI him, as that shot was that was a bad choice on director Ridley Scott's part. The movie jumps all over the fucking place like it's a chapter of a book, as it was confusing and annoying the shit out of me. And this movie doesn't give you any answers on why things are happening. They just happen right out of the fucking blue, like in the theatrical cut. And whatever doesn't happen. This movie is absolutely fucking boring in the most terrible way possible. You can read about Napoleon in the history books or on the internet. You don't really need to watch this movie in the theatrical nor the director's cut, as this is a solid non-recommendation. And as for Ridley Scott, with an exception of Alien, Blade Runner, The Martian, and I don't know about Gladiator, I'll get there next time, as far as director's cuts go, I think you really need to knock that bullshit off, because not every fucking movie needs a director's cut, like Kingdom of Heaven. That didn't need a director's cut. And what the fuck is this movie about? And I don't know, and I honestly don't care. And this is another one that doesn't need a director's cut. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with Gladiator. Finally, it took long enough. And until then, because Gladiator 2 is coming, and until then, let's go to the website of history and look up Napoleon. Don't watch this movie.